All right, this is week 7, I think. Um, but today we're going to cover some stuff that you hopefully have read in your textbook, that you hopefully are starting to get more familiar with, but things um, that are a little bit more tricky or advanced in CSS. So last week we talked about positioning elements on the page. We added 4 major elements: a header, a navigation bar, a content area, and a footer. Um, you guys created wireframes, and hopefully you're starting to position things around the page, and your pages are your HTML, CSS pages are starting to look more like your wireframes. But with that in mind, I wanted to talk about some more nuanced things, um, things that CSS properties and elements that um, are going to come into play as you start to get more advanced in your CSS. So we're going to start with margins and padding. We talked about this a little bit. I just want to make it clear and then also um, give you a resource that's actually a video so you can go back to it and take a look at it. So we'll talk about margins and padding. We're going to talk about borders, and then we're going to talk about positioning, which can be quite confusing, especially for beginners. Um, so hopefully I'll clarify some things about positioning, and then we will talk about CSS's problem solving. So that's the plan for this video. Let's get started. So week 6 we left off, this is what we had left off after the week 6 video ended. So again, we had our header, our navigation bar here in red, our content area here in gray, and our footer here in red. Okay, so we've got all our major elements. Let's talk a little bit about margins and paddings. So we talk about everything in HTML being a rectangle. So every tag that you see here is a rectangle, and the tags that are embedded in other tags are just smaller rectangles inside of larger rectangles. Okay, so that's an important concept to understand. What we'll do now is I'll explain the difference between margins and padding. So what we'll do is we'll move around the navigation bar, which is this big thing in red here. We'll move it around the screen a little bit just so you have an idea of what margins and padding are. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is I'll explain to you the 5 different properties that you can place on any element for margin. So you can place just margin, and so if we just say margin 100 pixels, what this will do is it'll add a margin of 100 pixels to the top, right, bottom, and left. So all 4 sides of the element you'll add a margin to. Okay, so if we did that, it would do a lot of crazy things here. So basically what we've done is we've added 100 pixels to the top, 100 pixels from the right, 100 pixels to the bottom, and 100 pixels to the left. And so that is what happens when you just use the margin. It goes all 4 areas, okay? We can do margin top, and we can specify where we want the margin on the page. Okay, so if we did margin top and we refresh, we can see we've added 100 pixels of margin from the top of the element. Okay, so 100 pixels of margin was added from the top of nav, since we've added 100 pixels to the top. Subsequently, we'll just go through each one. We can add 100 pixels to the right. Okay, so that added 100 pixels to the right. We can add 100 pixels from the bottom. Okay, so from the bottom of the navigation element, we added 100 pixels, so that pushes the subsequent element 100 pixels down or to the left. And that'll push your element 100 pixels from the left margin. Okay? So that's margins. It literally moves your rectangle It literally moves your rectangle whatever direction you want it to go. Okay, so it moves the entire element. Another thing I do want to show you too is when you do margin, you can actually specify, if you do just margin, you can actually specify all four top, right, bottom, left to top, right, bottom, and left to just the margin. So you could specify like I want 100 pixels on the top, I want 20 pixels on the right, I want 20 pixels on the bottom, and 100 pixels on the left. Okay, so just remember it goes from top to right to bottom to left. And that is, so it sort of moves clockwise on the screen. So if we did that, this is what it would look like. So top 100, right 20, bottom 20, left 100. So you can kind of see how you could control the positioning of items or the space between items using margins. Okay, so margins literally move your element around the screen depending on what you specify or how much of the margin you specify you want to move the element. Padding, on the other hand, does something completely different. So if we put 100 pixels of padding all around, what padding does is it adds to the base element. Okay, so we've put 100 pixels of padding on the top, bottom, right, and left. We can see it literally added 100 pixels to all of these elements. Now you're probably wondering, why isn't it spilling outside of this white area here? The reason why it's not is we've set a width in the container of 1280 pixels, right? And so that width is being applied to its child element. Okay, so we can't spill over unless we specify we want to spill over. Okay, so we can also, the same way we do margin top, right, bottom, and left, we can do padding top, right, bottom, and left. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, so we did a margin or a padding left, and what that did is it added 100 pixels of padding to the left. So you can see it pushed over the actual elements of the navigation bar. So if we took this off, you can see what it looks like originally. You can see that's where the original navigation bar was. We added the padding left, and it adds 100 pixels to the left. Okay, so you can see that padding and margins work a little bit differently. Padding top, you can see it'll add 100 pixels of padding to the top. And actually you can see it better on top and bottom because we're not restrained by the width of the container. Like if we wanted to add 500 pixels to the top, you'd really be able to see, okay, we've added 500 pixels to the top of our navigation bar. Or we could add 500 pixels to the bottom, and it's the same concept, right? So from the bottom of the nav, we've added 500 extra pixels of content or of element. Okay, so that's margins and padding. They're going to be really important for you as you start to move things around, right? Because they'll be particularly important for things like, well, we wouldn't want all of our content here to be aligned right on the left edge, right? That just looks weird. We don't, when you create a document in Microsoft Word, for example, you don't have 0-inch margins. You usually move over some of the elements, right? So if we wanted to do that, there's a couple things we could do. We could add margins to each of these elements, right? We could add margins to H1, paragraph, H2, list items, etc. But that would be kind of hard to do because we would actually have to add margins to 1, 2, 3, 4 elements. Instead, we could add padding to our content box, and it would produce the same exact result. So that's the difference between padding and margins, is that there's certain instances where you'd want to use padding and other instances where you'd want to use margins. So if we wanted to create some space between this left edge and all of our written content, we could just say padding left 20 pixels, and it would add 20 pixels to the left, and you can see it pushed over the content 20 pixels. Maybe we say that's not quite enough. Let's do 50 pixels. Okay, and so you can kind of see, you can see that we've added area, 50 pixels of area. Maybe we also want to add to the top and bottom. What we could do then is we could say padding, maybe we want 20 pixels at the top, 0 pixels at the right, 20 pixels at the bottom, and 50 pixels on the left, right? So again, we do the clockwise, we move clockwise starting at the top. So top 20, right 0, bottom 20, left 50. And so the only reason why we want to do that is it just saves code. It's just one piece of code instead of 4 pieces of code. But now we've got, some more padding, and it looks more like a normal document instead of having things pushed up exactly, to the left edge. Okay, so that's padding and margins. The second thing we're going to talk about is borders. So borders are actual physical lines that you can place, just like you can on with margins and padding. So if we said border 1 pixel solid, what we're doing is we're literally placing a border around our nav. Okay, and what we can do then is we can use it for, and you can kind of see it. It's really small. Let's blow it up so you can see it. If we make it 10 pixels, you'll really be able to see it. Okay, so you can see 10 pixels of border around our nav. Okay, so again, the same thing with padding and margins. If you just specify border and you put one value inside of border, it'll do it on all 4 sides. We can also do border top, bottom, left, and right. So if we said border bottom 10 pixels, it would just appear on the bottom of the element. And you can see that big black line on the bottom of the element. Or maybe we just want it on the top and bottom. We can do border top, right 0 pixels, bottom 10 pixels, and left 0 pixels. And it would, and it should work. Maybe not. So I guess for border, and I did not know this, but now I do, for border you have to specify separately. If you wanted to do border top 10 pixels solid, you would have to do the same thing for the bottom. And we would then have, gotta spell bottom, right? We would have a border appear on the top and the bottom. Okay, so you can start to see then interesting ways to sort of make your designs look more professional, more clean, more modern, whatever you're going for. We can start to use these elements to, sort of frame up some of our elements. And so another thing you can do too is so you can specify a width of the border. So this is a 10 pixel width. You can specify a border type, so you can do solid or dotted. So I'll show you what that looks like. So that's what a dotted border looks like, and that's what a solid border looks like. And then you can also you can specify a color, right? So you can actually use the hexadecimal code too if you'd like. But yeah, you can do a lot of different things with borders that are quite nice, okay? So I'm going to remove these, but one thing that you might want to do is, and one thing that lots of people do is, so instead of creating images for your buttons in your navigation bar, so lots of people used to create images back in the day, we can just create borders around our elements, right? So if we wanted to make our navigation bar, horizontal, we would have to do nav ulli, display inline. So that would make them right there. Now we've got our navigation bar. We've got our navigation bar horizontal. So the next thing we probably want to do is we'll probably want to push our navigation bar down. So we could also do margin top 50 pixels and push it down. I'm just using 50 as a guess. We would have to do this on the unordered list. So just on the unordered list, we could push down the element, and that was not right actually. So we do need to do it on the li. And I'm guessing this is not working because we have an A tag. So I wonder if we have to do, I'm sorry, I'm just experimenting. If we have to put the margin on the anchor tag and not on the li tag. Nope. Okay, well, I'll play around with this more and we'll talk about it more. But the other thing we would want to do then is I can kind of show you how putting a border around your list items in your nav bar can sort of make them appear like buttons. So and I don't know why this is not appearing, so let me open it in Firefox. Then we can at least see. Okay, that's the well. Okay. Solid. Let's see what this looks like. There we go. Okay, so it just was not big enough. I didn't specify a color for it. So let's go 5 pixels solid white. Right, and now these are sort of starting to look like buttons a little bit, right? One thing we might do is, if we put some padding at the top, what would happen? Nothing. Don't know why padding isn't working. I don't know why padding isn't working. I haven't done this in a while, so I'm learning alongside with you guys. So that's the idea of using borders as to create sort of button-looking things. And so you can kind of see that coming into shape. They're really ugly buttons right now, but we can start to make them look more like buttons using borders. Okay, so that is borders positioning. Okay, so positioning is really complicated. And it's actually not as complicated as you would think, but it's fairly complicated. Okay, so every item in an HTML document is positioned as has a default position. Okay, so the default position of every item in HTML is what's called static positioning. Okay, and all that means is the items appear in the order in which they appear on your HTML page. Okay, so if you've got your nav first or your header first, it's going to appear before your nav. If you've got your nav next and you have your content next, it'll appear after your nav, right? So whatever order, so it's sort of the most logical positioning. Whatever order things appear in your HTML page is the order that they appear on the screen. So you don't really have to worry about static positioning because that's the default. So you don't have to touch that. But there's different positionings that we can use to sort of move things around, okay? So what we'll do is I'll show you some different positionings on the nav once again. So we can position things absolute, okay? And when we position things absolute, this means that it takes the element out of the document flow, okay? So it removes nav from the document flow and it places it in the upper left corner of its parent element. Okay, so this should appear in the upper left corner of the container. Okay, so there we go. So basically what happens when you position something absolute is we position the nav absolute and it basically pulls the nav out of the document flow. So if you think of the document like having layers or being three-dimensional, the nav now is in a layer on top of the rest of the document. So you can see like this text here is getting covered by the nav because it's positioned absolute. Okay, so there's lots of reasons why we would want to position something absolute. And it was typically more used in the old days, absolute positioning. But as a general rule of thumb, one good use of absolute positioning is if you want to move something very far away from where its default location is. Okay, so if I wanted to move this nav up to the right-hand bar, I might use absolute positioning, right? So we could do absolute positioning, and then we could add things like bottom 100 pixels and push it to the bottom, or left 100 pixels and push it to the left, right? Or right 100 pixels and push it to the right. Okay, so there are a couple things that you may have noticed, and that is with absolute positioning and with any positioning, we don't necessarily use margins. We can use these properties just top, bottom, left, and right. And we can move things around the page using top, bottom, left, and right. Okay, so that's absolute positioning. There's very little reason why you would use absolute positioning. So I just want to explain that to you. You'll probably not need to use it. One thing you might use is what's called relative positioning. Okay, and so if we position something relatively, you'll see it looks like nothing has changed, and in fact nothing has changed. So relative positioning is actually quite useful because then we can move things around relative to where it's normally placed on the screen. So this is where it's normally placed. Now we can move, like if we wanted to move the entire nav to the right, we could use the property left and then push it over from the left 100 pixels. Right, and you can see the difference between margin left and relative positioning with a left 100 pixels. The difference is it spills over across the container here, right? And so there might be reasons why you'd want to spill over into elements into other elements. But yeah, if you didn't have this positioned relative and you just said margin left 100 pixels, it would push it over 100 pixels, but it gets cut off here. Okay, with relative positioning, so if we said position relative and then left 100 pixels, again, it'll spill over. It'll move the entire thing over 100 pixels. Okay, so that's static positioning, which is the default, absolute positioning, which pulls the element outside of the document flow and actually creates a 3D or multi-dimensions or layers to the element, and then relative positioning. And then, of course, we've talked about floats. We've talked about floats in class, so we can float things left and right as well. So if we floated our nav left and our content area right, we could create the illusion of a two-column layout. Okay? And then also one thing we'd want to do then is with floating, we would have to clear, you would put clear both on the footer because the footer comes after our content area. Okay? So anything that comes after a floated item will get sort of caught up in the mix unless you clear it. So there, you've cleared it. Okay. So there's a bunch of different positionings. For me, I think the easiest thing to manage is using floats for columns. People like to use a combination of relative and absolute positioning for columns. I think floating is easier to manage. And one thing I will show you is using percentages. Okay, so we've created a fixed width layout with our container, 1280 pixels. So that's what you see here. This is 1280 pixels wide. Excuse me. What we can do is we can set a width for each of our floated elements, and we can use percentages, which are easier to do than calculating the exact number of pixels that we want. And we can also sort of play around with it that way. So if we did 30% on our nav, and we wanted our content area to be 70%, you can kind of see what that would look like. Okay, and so one reason why this is happening, though, so you probably, if you're following along pretty well, you probably know why this is happening. So the reason why this is happening, these two things are still floated, but they're not pushed up next to each other, is because we've added that padding, right? So we've added this padding here, and that adds, I don't know how many pixels of padding, 20 pixels, or no, 50 pixels to the element, and so it's spilling, it's an extra 50 pixels. So we would have to remove that to put these things right next to each other. So let's just take off all of our padding for now here. And I'll show you what this looks like. Oops. Okay, so now we've got things that are pushed up right next to each other. The other thing we can do is, so you're going to run into this, you can see that our navigation bar only goes down so far, and it kind of looks weird. We would probably want it to go all the way down to the bottom, right? And so one thing we can use is what's called the min height property. And so basically, the reason why this is going to the bottom, not going to the bottom, is it defaults into however much content is in your box. Okay, so the height of the box defaults into, okay, we only have this much content. So instead of having to add a bunch of content to push this all the way down to the bottom, we can add what's called a min height to it. Okay, so if we set our min height to be like 500 pixels, for example, I'm just throwing a number out there. Okay, you can see the minimum height of this element now is 500 pixels. If we add more information in here, it'll push the footer down even more. But regardless of what we have in here, we've set a minimum height of 500 pixels. So if you set them both, the nav and the content area, min height, and again, you'll want to choose a height that you're comfortable with. I'm just choosing 500 pixels because I guessed, I made an educated guess on what would look okay. So now we've got min height 500 pixels going on both of them. And so now they're both even in even height, you can see. Okay, so that's the easiest way to I think, make columns, use a column layout. Okay, what else? What else? I'm trying to think. Okay, well, I think that's pretty much enough for right now. A couple things too that you'll want to be thinking about. The last thing that I wanted to cover was this idea of CSS as problem solving. Okay, so the past 3 weeks we've talked about some really basic things like being able to change background colors, being able to change fonts and things like that. And in next week's video I'll talk about how to use open source fonts and use Google Fonts and things like that. But I do want to stress the importance of CSS as problem solving. That is, there isn't one single way to create layouts and design in HTML and CSS. So that's really important to understand. Is I could make a site look just like this using completely different CSS code. Okay, so the reason why I tell you that is it's important then for you to be able to sort of do independent research and look up things and be able to implement those kinds of things into your own site and solve problems that way. Okay, so the idea is to be able to, I want to give you some basic foundational things like here's what absolute positioning is, here's the way floats work, but it'll be up to you then to kind of do your own independent research and solve your own problems. So things like, oh, I want to do a drop-down menu or a rollover menu. Well, it's really not that difficult to do, but you would have to do a little bit of research on how to do that. So I want you to not be discouraged about not being explicitly taught how to do a drop-down menu, but I want you to take advantage of using your problem-solving skills and really thinking about, okay, if I want to do a drop-down menu, how would I do that? How can I look through some tutorials and then implement it into my own design? So that's really important. That'll be really important for you. Another thing I do want to point out too is using margins for creating white space. So your traditional idea of white space is creating space between certain elements, right? To either increase proximity or to increase contrast or things like that. So if you want to create white space between elements, it's best you do it using margins and not do it in HTML using the BR tag, okay? So the BR tag is like putting a space in between an item in HTML. So I could add a BR tag here, and I would add one line of space before my paragraph tag. So I'll show you what that looks like. Right, so you saw that extra line of space added. And while that's an easy fix for you, you can see why that would be a problem in that every time you wanted a space, you would have to insert or remove a BR tag, when you can more simply just use margins in CSS and do it once, right? So maybe we want more space between the our H2s, okay? So we go to H2, and we say margin top 10 pixels. And then for all of our H2s now, it'll add margin top 10 pixels. So let me just do margin top 50 pixels just for illustrative purposes so you can see it. Okay, so now there's 50 pixels of space in between all of our elements. That might be too much space, but it makes all of your spacing uniform. Like, so every time you have an H2, regardless of what you have in your HTML, you add 50 pixels of space. Let me just add 150 just, again, for illustrative purposes. Right, so again, you've got 150 pixels. It's uniform, 150 pixels for every time H2 appears on the screen. Okay, again, that looks silly. You'd probably, 50 would probably be more appropriate, but just to show you, for things like spacing, we want to use margins. We want to use, right, and so since we know that padding won't work on the left here, because it spills over into and creates an extra, it creates too much width, we can also do like margin left 50 pixels on our H2, and we can move these elements over as well. Okay. Or actually what we could do is, sorry to confuse you all, but we could just actually do margin left in our content box 50 pixels and move everything over 50 pixels. Oh, I apologize, that did not work. Okay, yeah, that makes, oops. That makes, that will also spill over into the width. So yeah, we would have to put a margin left on each of these elements. But yeah, so that is margins and padding, borders, positioning, and problem solving. We'll talk more in class. Next week we'll talk about some specific things like inserting fonts, custom fonts, and things like that into your site. But hopefully you're comfortable enough to start playing around. Oh, one last thing I forgot to talk about is with positioning, we can also position things using fixed positioning. Okay, and fixed positioning is a lot like you'll see these on websites where they're like social media buttons will follow you around on a page. So if we fix a position, use fixed positioning on an element, we can, so let's do this. I'm going to make the min height 1000 pixels just so you can see. So if you've got like a really long page, you can fix the position and it actually will stay exactly, it'll be fixed exactly where you want it to be fixed. Okay, so you can see how this might be useful if you've got like a sub-navigation bar or you've got like content that goes below the fold and you want something to move along with it, right? So you can sort of make it appear like you've got some sort of animation going on, but really you've just fixed the position of this element. And when you scroll up and down, it stays there, okay? So that's simply just position fixed. All right, that's all I got for you. See you in class.